rate among black women, 16.3% among black men,
compared to 10.1% for whites. Now, it so happens a black-white unemployment gap, widening when times are bad, is sadly par for the course. In the Great Depression, in the Great Recession, as economist William Rogers told me in 2009.
When we entered the recession, African Americans started with a higher unemployment rate, and as we've gone through these last 16 months, the gap has widened.
Pre-pandemic, black unemployment had hit a record low of 5.8%, a fact President Trump often touted.
We have the best numbers we've ever had.
But Cook says black workers stuck in low-wage service jobs embody the old adage, last hired, first fired.
The last hired means that there's not the ability to accumulate income that makes African Americans less able to weather such a storm.
In Alabama's so-called Black Belt, the jobless rate is at 20%. Lydia Chapman of the Selma Center for Nonviolence.
So where other people are able to still survive, work from home, we don't have a whole lot of businesses and industries that allow for that. So the financial impact has been great.
The black-white wage gap among men is as large as it was in 1950.
That's New York Times writer David Leonhardt.
We see that black men make only 51 cents on the dollar relative to white men.
Therefore, says economist Trevon Logan,
much less of a cushion to cushion the blow. Much more likely then, of course, to need to be employed in the places where they are essential workers.
So yes, there would be desperation with respect to trying to find another job.
You guys need to provide us with masks. You need to provide us with gloves.
Starting in March, Amazon warehouse workers, disproportionately people of color, staged protests around the country over what they said were unsafe working conditions.
They're just talking about we're going by CDC standards, but when we call the CDC, they're not.
Amazon fired several of the activists, though the company has since rolled out safety measures. But good protection still isn't available to many of America's essential workers.
This coronavirus is for real. And we out here as public workers doing our job, trying to make an honest living, to take care of our families.
Detroit bus driver Jason Hargrove on March 21st in a Facebook video complaining about a passenger.
That woman that was on this bus that stood up behind the line where they not supposed to be and coughed 4 or 5 times and didn't cover up her mouth.
11 days later, Hargrove, a 50-year-old father of 6, died of COVID-19. African Americans like Hargrove make up only 13% or so of the U.S. population, but nearly double that percentage of transportation, warehouse, and delivery workers. Just imagine what happens to a family's finances when that worker is incapacitated or worse. And the problem is, African American finances have been deteriorating for years, says economist Logan.
Wealth actually has receded for African Americans since the last Great Recession. And in fact, the wealth disparities are larger than they were 20 years ago.
The typical white family has a net worth 41 times the typical black family, which is just remarkable.
And adds David Leonhardt, to a large extent, the wealth gap is a function of policy.
The U.S. government in the decades after World War II subsidized families to buy houses, which is a key way that people build wealth. But the way the policy was written, they essentially said, to get these low-interest loans, you have to live in a predominantly white neighborhood. The government justified this by saying that white neighborhoods were essentially better housing investments.
And then I looked at the map of Columbus, my home, right in that giant red box.
Black neighborhoods were literally redlined on maps for decades, off limits to the housing investment which builds wealth.
I can show you every city in the United States. It's the same in Indianapolis. It's the same in Cleveland. It's the same in Detroit. It's the same in Philadelphia.
And during the crash of 2008, those neighborhoods became hotbeds of sleazy subprime loans, and often as a result, foreclosure. Less wealth, and thus less access to capital for buying a home or building a business.
Having operating capital is everything. we are not afforded the same kinds of opportunities because we're looked at as a risk, and we're looked at as a risk because we don't have access to the capital in order for there not to be a risk.
Alfonso Cross owns Parlor, a craft cocktail lounge in Atlanta. It's in a building his family owns in a less fashionable part of town.
As a black business owner, there are still places that you cannot get a lease, no matter what.
But they don't say to you, we're not leasing to you because you're black.
Well, this isn't 1952. Of course they're not saying that.
But being locked out of high traffic areas means less revenue, even during the good times.
Throw a pandemic into the mix, and you now need access to more capital to get through this dumpster fire of a year.
African American businesses come to the pandemic smaller.
Mark Morial is president and CEO of the National Urban League.
Less of a reserve in cash and money, and therefore harder to weather the storm.
What's so infuriating to African Americans is that this is a legacy of an intentional past: slavery and Jim Crow. Most notably, segregation.
Segregation is the secret source that creates racial inequality in the United States.
Harvard sociologist David Williams in the 2017 TED Talk.
If you could eliminate statistically residential segregation, you would completely erase black-white differences in income, education, and unemployment.
And Williams might have added, perhaps the differences leading to a very different COVID-19 death rate. It's the reasons behind that death rate that we'll explore in our next Making Sense report.